There are 4 voices living inside your head. You have been listening to 3 of them for your entire life. The 4th one has been there the whole time, waiting, and almost nobody ever learns how to call it forward. Here is the difference. Not talent, not intelligence. Not the family you were born into or the opportunities that happened to find you. The difference between the life you are living and the life you can feel waiting somewhere just out of reach is which of those 4 voices you have handed the microphone to. And right now, in this precise moment, it is almost certainly not the 4th. Carl Jung spent 16 years of his life on this single question. Not on productivity, not on positive thinking, on the question of who exactly is speaking when you speak to yourself. He filled a leather-bound book with red covers trying to answer it, and for nearly a century, that book sat in a locked bank vault in Switzerland because his own family was afraid of what it contained. What he found in there is the most practical thing he ever discovered, and it is almost the exact opposite of what you have been told. You have been told to replace the negative voice with a positive one, to catch the bad thought and swap it for a better thought, to stand in front of a mirror and repeat something you do not yet believe until the repetition wears the disbelief down. Jung did not do that. Instead, he turned around and spoke to the voice. He treated it as a someone rather than a something. He asked it questions. He let it answer. He argued with it. And in the argument, the thing that had been running his life from behind a curtain for 38 years finally stepped out where he could see it. That is the method. It has a name, and the name has been sitting in his collected works the entire time, and almost nobody on the internet who quotes Carl Jung has ever mentioned it to you. Today, I am going to hand it to you. Not the version that has been diluted into a poster, not the version that has been flattened into a slogan. The actual mechanism, the way he practiced it, translated into 12 days and 4 movements that you can begin this afternoon without buying anything, without telling anyone, and without needing a single person's permission. But first you have to understand something that will feel uncomfortable for about 90 seconds. The voice that criticizes you is not you. I want you to sit with that because your mind will try to move past it quickly. The voice that tells you that you are behind, that you are too old, that you are not the kind of person things work out for, that everyone can tell, that you should have known better, that you always do this. That voice has a texture. It has a vocabulary. It has favorite phrases it returns to. It has a tone. And if you listen closely enough, for long enough, you will notice something that changes everything. That voice does not sound like you. It sounds like someone. Jung wrote a line that has been misquoted more than almost anything else he ever said. You have seen the popular version on 100 graphics. The real one is shorter, colder, and far more useful. When an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside as fate. Read it again slowly. Not, it becomes difficult. Not, it holds you back. It appears outside as fate. It stops feeling like a thought and starts feeling like the way the world simply is. It stops feeling like a voice and starts feeling like the truth. That is what an unexamined inner conversation does. It does not announce itself as an opinion. It disguises itself as reality. If that lands somewhere real in you, subscribe to this channel and press the like button before we go further, because what comes next is the part that most people have never been shown, and I would like you to be able to find your way back to it. Let us be precise about what we are dealing with, because the precision is where the power is. Most modern advice treats your inner critic as noise, as static, As a bad radio signal you need to tune out or drown under something louder, and so the entire strategy becomes volume. Speak over it, affirm louder. Think more positively than it can think negatively. Ask yourself honestly, has that ever worked for longer than a week? You repeat that you are confident, and something underneath answers, no, you are not. You repeat that you are worthy, and something underneath answers, say that again on Monday. You write the affirmation on the mirror, and by Thursday, the mirror has stopped meaning anything at all. There is a reason for this, and Jung identified it more than 100 years ago. The voice is not noise. The voice is autonomous. That word matters. Jung observed, across thousands of hours with patients and across an unflinching examination of his own mind, that the fragments living in the unconscious do not behave like passive recordings. They behave like independent beings. They have their own agenda. They have their own emotional charge. They can interrupt you, override you, and take the wheel of your behavior without asking. He called them complexes, and he noted, with the dryness of a man stating a mechanical fact, that it is not quite right to say that you have a complex. It is closer to the truth to say that the complex has you. Now hold that against what affirmations attempt to do. Affirmations attempt to talk over a being that can hear you. You are standing in front of a mirror, declaring that you are enough, while something intelligent and old and deeply invested stands behind you, listening to every word and taking notes. And it does not need to shout you down. It simply waits until you are tired, or embarrassed, or rejected, or 3 drinks in, and then it speaks once, quietly, and everything you built collapses in a single sentence. This is why you can know something and still not believe it. This is why you can read 40 books and still hear the same voice at 4 in the morning. This is why the strategy of volume has failed you, and it was never your discipline that was the problem. You were fighting the wrong war with the wrong weapon. Consider how strange your education actually was. You were taught to read, you were taught to write, you were taught to divide one number into another, and to name the capital cities of countries you would never visit. You were taught to sit still, raise your hand, and produce the correct answer within a fixed window of time. And in all of those years, in all of those thousands of hours, not one adult ever sat you down and taught you how to speak to yourself. Not one lesson, not one exercise, not one page. So you did what every human being does in the absence of instruction. You copied. You absorbed the tone of the people who were closest to you during the years when your mind was still soft and still forming. You inherited a manner of speaking to yourself the way you inherited an accent, without choosing it and without noticing it happening. And here is the part that will be uncomfortable, so I am going to say it plainly and then let it sit. Many of you are still, right now, in your 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, hearing a voice that belongs to someone who has not spoken to you in 20 years. Someone who may no longer live in your city. Someone who may no longer be alive at all. They stopped talking a long time ago. The voice did not. I want to tell you exactly what happened to the man whose name is on this video, because the story has been sanded down into a quote, and the quote has lost everything that made it useful. In 1913, Carl Jung was 38 years old, and by every external measure he had won. He was a physician with an international reputation. He had been the crown prince of the psychoanalytic movement, personally chosen by Freud as his successor. He had a wife, 5 children, a practice, a lakeside house, and a career that would have satisfied almost anyone. And he was coming apart. The break with Freud had cost him his professional home. He had begun experiencing visions he could not explain and could not stop. He was, by his own description, in a state of disorientation so complete that he was not certain he would come out of it intact. A man whose entire profession was the treatment of the mind was watching his own mind become a place he no longer recognized. Easier options existed. He could have medicated it. He could have traveled abroad. He could have thrown himself into work until the noise was buried under enough activity to be inaudible. Instead, he did something that almost no one would have the nerve to do. Before anything else, he wrote down the date. He knew it mattered. It was during Advent of the year 1913, December 12th to be exact. I resolved upon the decisive step. I was sitting at my desk once more, thinking over my fears. Then I let myself drop. Then I let myself drop. Not I pushed the thoughts away. Not I replaced them with better ones. Not I told myself that everything would be fine. Sitting at his own desk, in his own house, with his fear fully present, he stopped resisting the descent. He went toward the thing, and what he found down there was not chaos. It was not static. It was not random noise. It was populated. There were figures. There were voices. There were presences, with names and positions and opinions, and they did not dissolve when he looked directly at them. They looked back. They spoke. They had things to say that he had not thought of and would not have thought of, and some of what they said was so unlike his own mind that he spent years afterwards trying to account for it. Notebooks came first. Then he transferred them into an enormous volume bound in red leather, illustrated by hand, written in calligraphy, and he worked on it for 16 years. The Red Book. It was not published until 2009, nearly half a century after his death, because his family understood exactly how it would look to a world that only knew him as a clinician. But out of those 16 years came the technique. He called it active imagination. Its central rule, the one thing that separates it from every piece of self-talk advice you have ever received, is a single instruction. Do not talk over the voice. Talk to it. There is a moment in his account of that period that I think about constantly, because it is the moment the whole method becomes real and usable rather than mystical and vague. Sitting with one of these fantasies one afternoon, he stopped and asked himself a question any sane person would ask. In his own words, what am I really doing? Certainly this has nothing to do with science, but then, what is it? And something answered him, whereupon a voice within me said, it is art. Now, understand the position he was in. A voice inside his own head had just made a claim about the meaning of his life's work. It had told him what he was, and the claim was seductive. It offered him an identity, a category, a way to make sense of what he was doing. Most people, in that moment, do one of two things. They accept the verdict, or they panic. Jung did neither. Something else caught his attention first, not the content of the statement. The texture of it. I knew for a certainty that the voice had come from a woman. I recognized it as the voice of a patient, a talented psychopath who had a strong transference to me. Stop there. That is the entire first movement of what I am going to teach you, contained in one sentence. Notice what he did not ask. Not whether the verdict was right, but whose voice was delivering it. Having identified it, having recognized that the verdict had arrived wearing a borrowed face, using the intonation of a specific person from his actual life, he did something that changed the history of psychology. Instead, he answered it. I said very emphatically to this voice that my fantasies had nothing to do with art. What followed was an argument. Out loud, in his own mind, as one party to a real disagreement. And then, rather than declaring victory and walking away, he did the thing that separates this from an argument with yourself in the shower. Then he offered it a turn. I suggested that she use mine. She did so and came through with a long statement. Consider what that actually means. He handed over access to his own speech and let the thing make its case at full length. That is active imagination, and that is the whole of it. Notice the voice. Identify whose it is. Answer honestly, then let it answer back, and listen to what it says without deciding in advance that it is wrong. No affirming, no suppressing, no repeating a phrase until the phrase went numb. He held a conversation. In holding it, he discovered something he could never have reached by talking over it, that what spoke was neither an enemy nor a truth. It was a part of him that had gone unheard for so long that the only way it could get his attention was to speak in the borrowed voice of someone he could not ignore. That is what is happening in your head at 4 in the morning. Not an attack, a part of you that has been unheard for so long that it has learned to speak in the only voice you were ever forced to listen to. Everyone else will offer you 7 days. 7 is a comfortable number. It fits in a week, it sounds achievable, and it sells. I am going to ask you for 12, and I want to tell you exactly why, because I would rather you understand the reason than obey the instruction. There are 4 voices. Each one requires 3 days. 3 days is not arbitrary. On the first day of any of these movements, you will barely catch anything. You will be trying to notice something that has been invisible your entire adult life, and invisibility is a skill your mind has practiced for decades. On the second day, you will begin catching it in retrospect 20 minutes late, which feels like failure and is actually the exact moment the work begins. On the third day, and not before, you will catch it live. 12 days, 4 movements, 3 days each. Here are the 4, so you know the whole map before you take the first step. The first voice is the accuser. It is the one that arrived from outside and never left. It speaks in the second person. You always do this. You never learn. You should have known. It is the loudest, the oldest, and it is not yours. Beneath it sits the second, the ghost. This one is not a critic. It is a survivor. It is a younger version of you, frozen at the age when something happened, still running the strategy that kept you safe then and is quietly ruining you now. It does not speak in words so much as in reactions. Third comes the witness. You already possess this one and almost never use it. It is the part of you that can notice a thought without becoming it. Jung's entire framework rests on this distinction, and once you can hold it for even 10 seconds, the architecture of your inner life changes permanently. Last and quietest is the elder. Nobody teaches you to call this one. It is not your optimism, and it is not your ego. Jung had a phrase for it that he used in an interview with an American newspaper in 1936, and once you hear it, you will not forget it. He said that in his consulting room. Together, the patient and I address ourselves to the 2-million-year-old man that is in all of us. 2 million years of survival, adaptation, grief, courage, and repair, sitting inside you as a resource, and you have spent your life consulting a voice that belongs to someone who was unkind to you. In 1998, we are going to change who you consult, 1 movement at a time, 3 days each. Beginning now, it is 4 in the morning, something has woken you, and you do not know what. The room is dark, the house is quiet, and before you have decided to think about anything at all, a voice has already begun. Nothing about it is vague. It is remarkably specific. It has selected, out of the thousands of things that have happened in your life, the precise 3 that hurt the most, and it is presenting them in order. It reminds you of the thing you said in a room 11 years ago. It reminds you of the person who is doing better than you, with a level of detail that suggests it has been keeping records. It reminds you that you are running out of time, and it puts a number on it. And you lie there, in the dark, and you take it. Because it is 4 in the morning, and you have no defense prepared, and because on some level you have always assumed that this voice is simply you being honest with yourself when there is no one around to perform for. I want to break that assumption right now. That is not honesty. Honesty does not only ever arrive at night. Honesty does not exclusively remember your failures. Honesty does not use the second person. Listen to it again and notice the grammar. You always do this. You never think. You should be ashamed of yourself. What is wrong with you? Your own thoughts do not naturally use that construction. When you think about lunch, you do not think, you are hungry. You think, I am hungry. First person. The second person only appears when someone is being spoken to, which means somewhere in your history, someone spoke those exact words in that exact direction, and you kept the recording. Your task for days 1, 2, and 3 is not to fight this voice. It is to identify it. Every time you catch it, and you will catch it far more often than expected, once you know what to listen for, you ask one question. Not out loud, unless you want to. 4 words. Whose voice is that? That is the entire practice for 3 days, nothing more. Do not argue with the content. Do not defend yourself. Do not try to prove it wrong. Because the moment you begin defending yourself, you have already accepted the premise that a trial is taking place and that you are the accused. Just ask who is speaking, and then wait, without forcing an answer, for perhaps 4 or 5 seconds. What happens next surprises almost everyone. Something arrives, not always a name, sometimes only a room, sometimes a smell, or a specific chair, or the particular quality of light in a hallway you have not thought about in years. Sometimes it is a face, and you feel a jolt of recognition so physical that you sit up. It may be a parent, spoken in exhaustion at the end of a long day, meaning far less than you took from it. It may be a teacher who had 30 children and no patience and no idea that one sentence would still be running 30 years later. It may be a coach, a sibling, a first love, a manager, a congregation, an entire culture that confused contempt with standards. It may be someone you loved very much. That is the hardest one, and it is the most common. And I need you to understand something before you go looking, because this is where people either break through or shut down. You are not doing this to assign blame. What you are doing is establishing authorship. There is a difference, and the difference is everything. Blame keeps you bound to the person. It makes them the cause of your life, and therefore the owner of it. Authorship simply establishes a fact. This sentence entered my mind from a specific place at a specific time. It was not generated by me, and therefore it is not a verdict about who I am. It is a quotation. The moment a sentence becomes a quotation, it loses its authority. It can still be loud. It can still hurt. But it can no longer be true in the way it was true 5 minutes ago, because now it has a source, and sources can be wrong. Jung heard a verdict about his life's work, and his first move was to notice it had come from a woman with a transference to him. He located the speaker, and in locating the speaker, he demoted the statement from a fact about reality to an opinion held by a person. That is what you are doing for 3 days. You are not silencing anything. You are taking a voice that has been broadcasting anonymously your entire life and putting a name on the transmitter. Some practical notes, because I want you to actually succeed at this rather than merely agree with it. Expect to be late. For the first day or two, you will notice the accuser 20 minutes after it has finished speaking, usually because you suddenly feel terrible and cannot immediately say why. That delay is not failure. That delay is the measurement of how automatic the process has been, and it shrinks fast. Expect a specific defense. At some point, the voice will say something like, "This is just realism," or "Someone has to keep you honest," or "If you stop doing this, you will become arrogant and lazy and everyone will see." That is not an argument. That is a survival move from something that senses it is being observed. Ask the question again. Expect grief. This is the one nobody warns you about. When you finally identify the voice and it turns out to belong to someone you loved, there is a sadness that arrives with the recognition. Let it arrive. It is not a setback. It is the cost of the truth, and it is much lower than the cost of continuing. 3 days, 4 words. Whose voice is that? Before we go to the second voice, I want to ask you for something. If a name came back to you just now, or a room, or a face, or the particular quality of light in a hallway, put it in the comments below. Not the whole story. You do not owe anyone the whole story. Just the age you were when that voice first started speaking. You are going to scroll through what other people wrote and discover that you have been carrying something almost everybody carries, and that nobody ever says out loud. That recognition is worth more than anything else I can hand you in the next 40 minutes. Hearing the second voice is harder because it very rarely uses words. The accuser is loud, verbal, and grammatically obvious. The ghost is silent and enormous. It speaks in reactions. Here is how you will know you have met it. Something small happens. A message is left unanswered for 6 hours. A colleague uses a slightly flat tone in a meeting. Someone you care about closes a door a little harder than necessary. Your partner says, "We need to talk," and means about the car. And out of all proportion to the event, something in you detonates. Your chest tightens, your face goes hot, your thinking narrows into a tunnel, and within 90 seconds you have constructed an entire narrative in which you are about to be abandoned, exposed, dismissed, or destroyed. A narrative so vivid and so fast that it arrives fully formed, as though it had been prepared in advance. Because it had been. That reaction is not about the message, the tone, the door, or the car. It belongs to a much younger person who is still living inside you at the age they were when the original thing happened, still running the strategy that kept them safe at that age, and still absolutely certain that the strategy is required. Jung understood this better than almost anyone, and he described it in a way that I find more useful than any modern language. He said that when you are gripped like this, you are not the one acting. The complex is acting. Your ordinary personality has been temporarily displaced by an older, narrower, more frightened one that has taken the controls. You have watched this happen to other people. You have seen an adult you respect suddenly become 15 years old in the middle of an argument. The face changes, the vocabulary changes, the logic collapses into something rigid and defensive that they will be embarrassed by within the hour. Seeing it in yourself is much harder, because when it happens, the part of you that would notice is exactly the part that has been displaced. So your task for days 4, 5, and 6 is to build a detector. 1 question, 5 words, and you deploy it the instant you notice a reaction that is louder than its cause. How old am I right now? Do not answer with your actual age. Answer with the first number that appears. I want to prepare you for how strange this is going to feel, because the first time it works properly, it is genuinely disorienting. You will be standing in your kitchen, 39 years old, holding a phone, furious about something that objectively does not warrant fury, and you will ask the question, and the answer that comes back will be 11, and you will know, with total certainty, and without having to reason your way there, that it is correct. That number is not a metaphor. It is a location. It is telling you where in your history this reaction was manufactured, and once you know the address, the reaction stops being a fact about the present and becomes information about the past. Now here is the part that separates this from every other technique, and it is the part I most want you to get right. Do not tell the ghost to leave. This is the mistake almost everyone makes with an inner child, a trauma response, a trigger, or whatever vocabulary they have been handed. They treat it as an intruder. They try to reason it out, shame it out, or breathe it out. They tell the 11-year-old to grow up, understand what the 11-year-old actually did. They developed a strategy under real pressure, with no resources, no power, and no way out. And the strategy worked. It got them through. They are the reason you are here. That hypervigilance, that people-pleasing, that instinct to go quiet, that habit of leaving before you can be left, that compulsion to be so useful that nobody could justify getting rid of you, every one of those was an intelligent adaptation to a situation you did not choose. Nobody is sabotaging you. That part is still on duty. Nobody ever told it the shift ended. So instead of dismissing it, you do what Jung did with the voice that told him his work was art. You give it a turn to speak. 3 sentences. That is all. You can do it silently, in a car, in a bathroom, at a desk, and no one will know. I see you. What are you afraid is about to happen? How old were you when you learned that? Then be quiet for 10 seconds and let something come back. Something will come back. Usually a single, very plain sentence, and it is almost never sophisticated. They are going to leave. I am about to be humiliated. If I am not perfect, they will stop. It is going to be my fault again. That plainness is how you know it is real. The unconscious does not speak in paragraphs. It speaks in short declarative sentences that sound like they came from a child, because they did. Here is what happens in the moment you hear it clearly. The charge drops. Not all of it, not permanently, not the first time, but measurably, immediately, and in a way you can feel in your chest. The alarm was never trying to ruin your evening. It was trying to deliver a message, and it escalated because nobody had ever acknowledged receipt. Once you acknowledge receipt, it does not need to shout. Some notes for these 3 days. You will not catch the big ones first. You will catch the medium ones, the flash of irritation, the disproportionate sulk, the 2 hours of low mood after a neutral email. Start there. The medium ones are the training ground. Some of the ages that come back will not make sense to you, and you may not know what happened at that age. That is fine. You do not need the memory to work with the reaction. The number alone changes your relationship to it. And if nothing comes back at all, if you ask and there is only silence, do not force it. Say the first sentence anyway. I see you. Say it and mean it. Something that has been ignored for 30 years does not necessarily answer on the first invitation, and the invitation still counts. 3 days, 5 words. How old am I right now? Now something shifts. The first 2 movements were archaeology. You were identifying what is already there, dating it, and giving it a name. The third movement is different in kind. In the third movement, you stop excavating and start relocating. You move. Right now, and for most of your life, you have lived inside your thoughts. Not near them, not alongside them, inside them, in the way a fish lives inside water, which is to say, without any awareness that there is such a thing as water at all. When the thought arrives that you are failing, you do not experience a thought about failing, you experience failing. Should the thought arrive that they are angry with you, you do not experience a hypothesis. You experience their anger in your body as a completed fact. This total fusion is the ordinary human condition, and it is the single most expensive thing about being a person. Because as long as you are inside the thought, you have no leverage on it. You cannot examine a room you are standing in the middle of with your eyes closed. Jung's contribution here is precise, and it is the thing most people quote without understanding. You are not the contents of your mind. You are the awareness in which those contents appear. The ego, the I you take yourself to be, is itself only one complex among many, and the fact that it has been holding the microphone does not make it the whole orchestra. If that sounds abstract, I am going to make it concrete in one sentence, and this sentence is your practice for 3 days. Take whatever the mind is currently asserting and put this in front of it. I notice I am having the thought that. That is it. 7 words and a colon. I am going to embarrass myself tomorrow becomes, I notice I am having the thought that I am going to embarrass myself tomorrow. They regret hiring me becomes, I notice I am having the thought that they regret hiring me. I have wasted my 30s becomes, I notice I am having the thought that I have wasted my 30s. Say them both in that order and pay attention to what changes. The content does not change at all. Not one word of the accusation has been altered, contradicted, or softened. Nothing has been affirmed. Nothing has been denied. And yet, the second version does not land the same way in your body. Because in the first version, there is no one there but the thought. In the second version, there are suddenly 2 things in the room, a thought and someone noticing it. And the moment there are 2 things in the room, you are no longer the thought, you are the room. This is why this works when affirmations do not, and I want to make the mechanism explicit because it is the most useful thing in this entire video. An affirmation makes a claim, I am confident. And the instant a claim is made, some part of you evaluates it, and if the evidence is not there, the evaluation comes back negative, and you have just given the accuser a fresh target. This is why affirmations so often make people feel worse. You have handed the prosecution a statement to cross-examine. The witness sentence makes no claim at all. I notice I am having the thought that I am not confident. There is nothing there to argue with. It is entirely, unarguably true. You are, in fact, having that thought. The sentence is bulletproof, and because it is bulletproof, no defense gets mounted, and no defense means no escalation, and no escalation means the thought is simply allowed to be present without being obeyed. You have not fought it. You have not fed it. You have simply stopped being it. For 3 days, do this with everything, not only the painful thoughts. Do it with the pleasant ones, the boring ones, the plans, the resentments, the fantasies about what you will say to that person one day. The point is not to filter your mind. The point is to become fluent in the gap between having a thought and being one. A few things will happen, and I want you to expect them. There will be, at some point, a strange spaciousness, a small, quiet, slightly unfamiliar room appearing between something happening and your reaction to it. That gap is where every choice you have ever wanted to make actually lives. It has always been there. You have simply been moving through it too fast to notice. At some point, you will also catch yourself using the witness sentence to avoid feeling something. I notice I am having the thought that I am devastated, used as a way to hold the devastation at arm's length. Watch for that. The witness is not a wall. It is not detachment, and it is not numbness. You are not stepping away from your life. You are stepping back far enough to see it. You will also fail at it constantly. You will be fused with a thought for 2 hours before you remember the practice exists. Every single time you remember, you have succeeded. The remembering is the skill. There is nothing else to get. 3 days, 7 words. I notice I am having the thought that. We come to the fourth voice, and this is the one that almost nobody is taught to call. Let me tell you what it is not, because the false versions are everywhere. It is not your ego. Your ego is loud, defensive, and permanently concerned with how things look. It is not forced optimism. Forced optimism is the accuser wearing a bright coat, and you can always identify it because it has to keep insisting. It is not a fantasy version of you with more money and a better body. That is just wanting, dressed up in the language of growth. The fourth voice is quieter than all of those, and it has a very particular quality that you will recognize the moment you hear it. It is not impressed and not alarmed. Jung had 2 ways of pointing at this, and I want to give you both, because between them they triangulate something no single definition can hold. The first comes from his childhood, and it is one of the most remarkable admissions in his memoir. As a boy in Switzerland, he became aware that he was, in some way he could not explain to anyone, 2 different people. He wrote, "Somewhere deep in the background, I always knew that I was 2 persons. One was the son of my parents, who went to school and was less intelligent, attentive, hard-working, decent and clean than many other boys. The other was grown up, old in fact, skeptical, mistrustful, remote from the world of men, but close to nature. He called them personality number 1 and personality number 2. Number 1 was the schoolboy, anxious about marks, aware of who was better at things, living entirely inside a single decade of a single century in a small town and treating that as the whole of reality. The second was old. Not old as in elderly, old as in unhurried, old as in having seen all of this before. It did not care about the schoolboy's rankings, not because it was above them, but because from where it stood, they were simply not the relevant scale. Most people meet number 2, 2 or 3 times in a lifetime, usually by accident, at 4 in the morning by a hospital bed, or alone on a mountain, or in the flat silence after everything has already gone wrong and there is nothing left to protect. And they always describe it the same way. I was calm. I do not know why I was calm. His second way of pointing at it is the one I gave you earlier, from a New York interview in 1936. Together, the patient and I address ourselves to the 2-million-year-old man that is in all of us. Sit with the arithmetic for a moment. Everything you are made of has been tested. Every instinct you carry was carried by someone through famine, migration, plague, loss, war, childbirth without medicine, and winters without heat. And it worked, every single time, or you would not be here to hear this. You are the current end of an unbroken chain of survivors, 2 million years long. Meanwhile, the voice you have been consulting about whether you are good enough belongs to someone who was in a bad mood in a kitchen in 1998. We are going to change who you consult. Here is the practice for the final 3 days. Once each day. And the best windows are the first 10 minutes after waking and the last 10 before sleep, because in those transitional states, the ordinary guard is down. You are going to hold a conversation, not a visualization, not an affirmation, a genuine two-directional conversation, exactly as Jung practiced it. You bring one real thing to it, not a vague sense of dissatisfaction, and not a general wish that life were different. One specific, current, unresolved situation. The conversation you are avoiding. The decision you have been circling for months. The person you cannot forgive. The thing you would do tomorrow if you were not afraid. Then you ask, what would the one who already made it through this say? Not, what should I do? Not, what is the right answer? What would that one say? And then, and this is the part that everyone skips, and it is the only part that matters, you stop, and you let it answer, and you do not write the answer for it. I want to be very direct about how this actually goes, because the descriptions people give are usually mystical, and the reality is much plainer. For the first 2 or 3 attempts, you will get nothing but your own thinking wearing a costume. You will recognize it because it sounds like advice, and it will be advice you have already given yourself 100 times. Let it pass and stay in the silence. Then, at some point, something arrives that is different. It will be short, shorter than you expected, usually 1 sentence, sometimes 4 or 5 words. What comes will not be reassuring in the way you wanted. Very often, it is the opposite of comforting. You already know. You are not confused. You are afraid. Stop asking me and go. It is not going to get easier. Do it anyway, and it will not sound entirely like you. That is the marker. Jung's own account turns on exactly this. The statement that arrived did not match what he expected or wanted, which is precisely why he knew it had not come from the part of him doing the expecting. Write down what comes, every time. Even when it is 4 words, even when it seems obvious in retrospect, especially when it is uncomfortable. Jung filled a book with red covers for 16 years, and the world eventually put it in a museum. You are going to fill a cheap notebook, and it will do the same job. Now, one warning, and it is the most important sentence in this movement. You are not doing this to receive orders. Should a voice inside your head start issuing commands, making grand pronouncements about your destiny, telling you that you are special or chosen, or instructing you to do something that would harm you or anyone else, you are not talking to the elder. You are talking to an inflated ego that has learned to use a deeper vocabulary, and Jung was blunt about the danger of exactly this. The elder does not flatter, and it does not command. It clarifies. It removes the noise around a thing you already knew, and hands you back the shape of it. If what you hear makes you calmer and more honest, keep going. If what you hear makes you grander, stop and come back to movement 3. 3 days, 1 question. What would the one who already made it through this say? Let us talk about what you should expect, because I would rather set an accurate expectation than an exciting one. Some of this you will feel in your body first, and quickly. A low-grade internal argument has been running for so long that you have stopped registering it as effort. It is effort. It is metabolically expensive to be at war with yourself. When the argument quiets, people commonly report that they sleep more deeply, that their jaw is less tight, that their shoulders sit lower, that they stop waking at the same hour every night with their heart already going. Not because anything mystical occurred, because a persistent stress signal that had been firing all day and half the night finally stopped firing. Some of it you will notice in how other people behave, which will feel strange because you will not have told anyone what you are doing. You will become less defensive, and you will not have decided to be. Defensiveness is what a person does when an outside comment threatens to join an inside prosecution that is already underway. Once the prosecution is not running, criticism lands as information rather than as confirmation. You will be able to hear that something you made is not working without hearing that you are not working. Patience toward other people arrives without any effort at all, and you will notice that you did not have to manufacture it. The patience you extend outward is almost always left over from the patience you extend inward. People who are relentless with themselves are relentless with everyone. You will find yourself less interested in certain conversations. The complaint circles, the shared cynicism, the ritual pessimism that used to feel like intimacy. Something in you will simply lose the appetite. This one can be lonely for a while, and I would rather tell you that now than let it take you by surprise. And some of it will be very small and very quiet, and will matter more than all of the above. There will be a morning, 3 or 4 weeks from now, when you make a mistake, an ordinary one, a mistimed message, a forgotten task, and you will observe yourself not attacking yourself for it. No triumph, no breakthrough, no feeling of victory, just a mistake, noticed, corrected, and set down. And half an hour later, it will occur to you what did not happen, and you will realize that the thing which has followed you since you were 9 years old did not come, and you did not have to fight it off. It simply did not come. That is what this looks like when it works. Not fireworks, an absence. Now let us be completely honest with each other about what is coming, because if I send you into this unprepared, you will interpret an entirely predictable obstacle as personal failure and stop. You will forget, not once, repeatedly, and for whole days at a time. You will be 4 days in, doing well, and then a difficult week will arrive, and you will surface on the following Tuesday, having done none of it. This is not evidence that it does not work, and it is not evidence about your character. It is what happens when a 12-day practice meets a life. Begin again from the movement you were on. Do not restart from day one as a punishment. That is the accuser writing your training plan. Things will get worse before they get better. Somewhere around days 3 to 5, most people go through a bad patch, and the reason is almost funny. For the first time, you are actually hearing the volume of what has been playing in the background your whole life. You have not made it worse. You have made it audible. It is like moving into a house near a motorway you had never consciously registered. The first week you cannot believe the noise, and the noise was always there. The voice will get cleverer. This is the one that catches people. Once you begin naming the accuser, it stops making crude statements and starts making sophisticated ones. It stops saying, "You are stupid," and starts saying, "You are being self-indulgent." Other people have real problems. This is navel-gazing. You should be working. It will use your intelligence against you. It will use your values against you. When the criticism suddenly becomes more articulate and more reasonable, that is not you outgrowing the practice. That is the practice working and the complex adapting. Ask the question anyway. Whose voice is that? Someone will make a comment. Perhaps a partner, perhaps a friend, perhaps a family member, and it will be light and it will be a joke and it will land harder than it should. Oh, you are doing your inner work now. Understand what is actually happening. Your inner conversation is load-bearing in your relationships. Other people have built their expectations on top of the version of you that apologizes first, gives in fastest, and does not ask. When that version starts to change, the structure shifts, and people feel the shift before they can name it. Most of them will adjust, some will not. That information is worth having, and your rational mind will object. It will point out that this is only talking to yourself, that it is unscientific, that a question cannot possibly undo 20 years. Let it object. Then notice that the objection arrived in the second person. There is a voice in your head right now. That voice has been there since you opened your eyes this morning, and it will be there when you close them tonight, and it has been running for so long that you long ago stopped experiencing it as a voice and started experiencing it as the truth about who you are. It is not. What you are hearing is a recording made by someone else in a room you can no longer clearly remember, at a moment when you were far too young to evaluate whether it was accurate. And underneath it, underneath the accuser, underneath the ghost, underneath the ordinary chattering self that has been holding the microphone your whole adult life, there is something 2 million years old that has never once been consulted. Waiting is what it does. Not impatiently. That is not its nature. Jung sat at his desk on the 12th of December, 1913, with his fear entirely present and no idea whether he would come back intact, and he did the only thing that has ever actually worked. He stopped talking over it. Then he turned around, asked it who it was, and stayed quiet long enough to hear the answer. That is available to you tonight. Not in 12 days, tonight, in the next argument you have with yourself, which by my estimate will begin within the hour. You will feel the familiar shape of it starting up. The old grammar, the second person, the list. And this time, instead of taking it, or fighting it, or drowning it under something louder, you are going to do the one thing it has never been asked in its entire long career of running your life. 4 words. Whose voice is that? Ask, and then be quiet, and listen for what answers. Everything after that is just 12 days of practice. If this reached something in you, subscribe. This channel goes underneath the surface of how we think, why we do what we do, and who is actually speaking when we speak to ourselves. And share this with the person you thought of, somewhere around the middle of this video. You know the one. They have been carrying a voice that does not belong to them for a very long time, and nobody has ever told them that it can be given back.